Nursing unions say a 1% pay rise is pitiful, but in a labour market reshaped by COVID, are they right? Nurses wanted a 12.5% rise, and this chart from the Nuffield Trust demonstrates why. It shows pay compared to 2010 earnings, that is adjusted for inflation, and it reveals that a decade of austerity pay caps saw real terms earning for nurses fall almost 10%. That gap did start to close after a 3-year pay deal worth around 3% was agreed in 2018. The blue line, the light blue line, is private sector earnings. They also dipped after the financial crash, but they recovered before the pandemic struck. But Rishi Sunak is worried about another gap between overall public and private sector pay. When he announced a pay freeze for everyone bar healthcare workers last November, he said this public sector premium was growing too fast. You can see 3 years ago, the average weekly wage for both public and private sector workers was about £530. Now, public pay rises started to open the gap, and it grew when the pandemic closed down chunks of the economy. That's this big gap here. But it had almost closed to parity at the end of 2020. But private sector jobs are also much less secure. New figures show more than 8 million people, almost a third of the workforce, were highly vulnerable to losing their jobs or having their hours cut during the first year of the pandemic. Now, the jobs likeliest to be affected included construction workers, security guards, cleaners. But healthcare workers were among the least vulnerable. Now, many of the most economically insecure workers are also the most vulnerable to the disease. We know security guards, drivers, retail workers all have elevated COVID risk, but so too, of course, the health and social care workers. In truth, the pandemic has blurred the lines between public and private sector pay. So far, the state has spent £73.5 billion on furlough and self-employment support. That's effectively nationalised millions of private sector jobs, and it's not over yet. By comparison, 1% on nurses' salaries costs the Treasury around £500 million. Whether to spend it isn't just a question of how we value their work, but it is ultimately a political calculation.